In 2003, Ted and his 19-year-old son had this weird experience they couldn't explain. It was just an average morning in April in Pennsylvania. They had gone to the Blue Mountain fishing lakes. Ted noticed something odd as soon as they got out of the car. There was a strange smell. It smelled pretty bad, like a mix of a dead animal and a storm. But weirdly, the sky was clear without any signs of rain. They hung around there all morning but didn't catch a lot of fish. They sort of felt like maybe they didn't catch much because they forgot their lucky fishing rods. When they were fishing, they kept feeling like something wasn't right. Ted's son, who didn't say his name, also said he felt uneasy the whole time. Ted kept hearing this weird, loud noise from somewhere far off that felt like it was right in his ears and head. He also thought it was odd because usually a lot of people come to this spot to fish, but that day there was hardly anyone around. At first he didn't think it had anything to do with what happened that day. After a few hours, they thought it was time to go home. When Ted started the car, he noticed it wasn't running smoothly, like there's something wrong with the engine. But there were no warning lights, so he just thought it's one of those car issues that happen sometimes. After going for a bit, the car seemed okay. When he was about to turn, his son said they had a tail. Ted glanced in the back mirror and saw a big black SUV. After a little more driving, his son started freaking out. "Hey, Dad, I think those guys are tailing us," he said to Ted. He looked again in the rearview mirror and confirmed that the SUV was indeed still behind them. Ted then made a few more unplanned turns, drove down some back roads, yet the SUV was still trailing them. Recognizing that this wasn't a good sign, Ted decided to stop in a nearby vacant parking lot. The black SUV pulled up and parked in the lot and didn't move. Ted and his son were panicking. Ted hurriedly grabbed his gun from near his seat, worried that trouble was coming their way. His 19-year-old son was really stressed out. It seemed to take forever, but eventually two guys in suits got out of the SUV and came over to Ted's side of the car. Ted said those guys were acting weird. They seemed average, but he had a feeling they might be in a gang or something. They asked Ted a bunch of weird stuff, even pointing out that he's been hanging out at the lake a lot. Ted felt pretty pissed off and uncomfortable with all the questions they were throwing at him. He finally got fed up and asked them who the hell they were. The guys just smirked, told him to have a nice day, and that they'll be keep an eye on him. And just like that, they jumped back into their SUV and drove off. Not long after that, Ted started to find anonymous letters in his mailbox. The letters looked weird, like they were written in code. A lot of it didn't make sense, but there were parts that said, "We are watching you, and you spend too much time around Blue Mountain Lake." Stuff like that. Even "We were sent to monitor what you know." Ted got a bunch of these letters over the next month and decided to tell the cops. The cops didn't know what to do with it all, but then it just kind of stopped. Ted still doesn't know what was going on at the Blue Mountain fishing lakes. He and his son felt something off that day, like a weird smell. He thinks it might be connected to what happened later. Some people seem to know he'd been there and were trying to keep him away. The whole thing is really weird, and honestly, I can't make heads or tails of it myself. Sounds a bit like something from Men in Black, where people are hassled for stuff they know. But there are some differences here. If this is a Men in Black kind of thing, what did Ted and his kid know that had these guys all worked up? The big question, though, why all the weirdness when they got to the lake? What was so special about what they saw that these dudes don't want anyone to know about? We've got a lot of questions, but not many answers. Riding an ATV in Moab, Utah is amazing, with all those big red rocks everywhere. I really like adventures and thrill-seeking. Going over rough trails, braving the hot desert, and enjoying the cool breeze is totally my thing. Once, I was on my ATV tackling a tough trail. I was surrounded by these gorgeous red canyons and rocks. I was really into the awesome view. That's when stuff began to change out of the blue. I was just chilling, driving my ATV on the side of a hill. I could hear the engine's noise and feel the wheels moving over the gravel path. When I turned, my tires kicked up some rocks, but my ATV's tough shocks took care of most bumps. I was having too much fun to notice the silence at first or the sudden drop in temperature. That was pretty odd considering it was a sunny day. Usually, even in the desert, there's birds chirping, bugs flying around, or maybe even a rabbit or coyote wandering about. That afternoon, something felt off in the desert. I had a feeling something was up when that coyote popped out of the bush and scared the living daylights out of me. You see plenty of them around Moab, but this one, it was different, man. It had this super dark fur, almost like looking at the night sky. It was as quick as a cheetah, keeping up with my ATV no problem. But those eyes, I'll never forget them. I caught them in my side mirror. They were glowing red, really stood out against its black fur. Never seen a coyote with eyes like that. I got this strange vibe from the animal, like it was checking me out. Its red eyes seemed to follow me, and it really freaked me out. Suddenly I felt chilly, and I didn't know why. I thought I'd better crank up the car and bolt away from there. It sort of sucked the joy out of my trip. It was so silent in the desert, and I felt kind of alone and got this odd vibe that something was off. I had no clue how weird it was going to get that wild afternoon among those red rocks. After you bump into a weirdo, your mind starts making stuff up. That day in Moab, I saw something weird that really stuck with me. I was speeding on my ATV through this rocky trail, and all around me were these massive red rocks. Little did I know that something was about to happen that would be hard to forget. On top of that, there was this strange-looking coyote. But I pushed on, even though I was starting to feel a bit uneasy without knowing what was coming next. Then, suddenly, I saw something far off. It looked like a person, but they were moving weirdly. Despite the heat, I could tell they were heading my way. I started to feel pretty freaked out on my ride. My heart was pounding so hard. As I got nearer, I saw this super thin wild person with really long, untidy hair. But then they kind of changed, like the way you see those mirages in the hot desert. Suddenly, the person began to transform right in front of me, as if their skin was alive. I was so shocked I couldn't even breathe when I noticed they were becoming the same black coyote I'd just escaped from. Seeing it freaked me out so much I nearly fell off my ATV. I heard this coyote howling, a really creepy sound that seemed to echo around the desert and in my head. I was totally freaked out by its red eyes looking at me. I couldn't believe it, so I rubbed my eyes and then took off, trying to put as much distance between me and that thing that had just turned back into a coyote. The ATV was really noisy as I drove it over the rocks and sand. It kind of kept me sane during that wild experience. When I was sure that weird creature was far behind me, I stopped on a hill to rest a bit. So there I was, just resting, and then out of nowhere, I wasn't afraid anymore. I was just... You won't believe this, but I actually saw someone turn into a coyote. I know it sounds crazy. Once I cooled off a bit, a word popped into my head. Skinwalker. I heard this Navajo tale about a witch who could shapeshift into an animal. Could that be what I ran into? Was there some sort of legend or beast from Native American folklore lurking around here in Moab, Utah? I got on my ATV and rode home. With so many questions in my head, that day totally changed my perspective. I was after some excitement, but this was way beyond what I expected. But I began to value and respect the sudden lessons I was picking up. Standing in that desert with all the red rocks, I kind of got a feel for its history and started wondering about all the unsolved mysteries out there in the world. I went on a normal ATV ride, but it turned out to be quite an adventure. It was kind of a wake-up call, how there's so much about the world we just don't understand. You won't believe this crazy thing that happened to me during a late-night truck haul in Oregon's thick forest. Being a truck driver, you see all sorts of weird stuff, especially on those lonely roads and in odd little towns. So I was right in the middle of Oregon's pretty well-known forest, where your cell phone and radio give you nothing. Man, it's seriously dark out there. It's really dark and creepy. Especially when you're driving through woods, it gets kind of scary. I was in Oregon during the nighttime in complete darkness, thinking about being alone in my truck, with nothing but quiet trees and hidden animals around me. I was trucking along Route 58. It had been a long day and I needed a break. I stopped at the next rest area to shower and sleep. Sadly, the next stop was tiny, barely enough room for 2 trucks, and there weren't a lot of facilities. I was really beat and didn't want the hassle of driving to the next spot, even though it was near to town. It was a dark night with no moon, so the only light I had was from my truck and a dim, barely glowing light on the park sign. I normally shoot the breeze with the other truckers on the radio, talking about everything from our families to the weekend footy game. But now the radio was on the fritz, and I was out of network. I was pacing up and down, hitting my sides to keep warm, and reminding myself about the creepy, empty roads I'd passed. Looking up, the sky looked completely dark, one of the darkest I've ever seen. On nights when the sky was clear, there were countless stars to see. But I remember that night was cloudy, with gray clouds moving overhead. All of a sudden, I got goosebumps. The air had a weird smell to it. At first, I figured the smell was coming from those restrooms over there, but no, it wasn't that. It was something else, and it stunk pretty badly. I looked up and saw the clouds going by quickly. There was this noise which I initially thought was just wind, but it had a pattern to it. It was so low that I even thought I might be making it up in my head. There's this weird background noise, kind of like thunder, but the sky's full of gray clouds and yet it doesn't seem like it's gonna rain. Funny how your mind can mess with you when you're by yourself, huh? I shrugged it off, but the sound kept going. Then I figured out it wasn't thunder. It was an animal growling. Realizing that I was out there with an animal was pretty freaky. I wouldn't want to be around any mad creature, not even a raccoon. Those things can get really bad. I heard some noise coming from the restrooms, and immediately my eyes shot towards the row of portable toilets. One of the doors was stirring a bit. I thought it might be a raccoon or possum attracted by our scent. Maybe it was sniffing around for leftover food in our trash cans. I was about to go back to my truck when I heard a big bang. Something had knocked all the portable toilets into the parking lot. I quickly turned towards the noise, and there it was, lit up by my flashlight. The scary thing was huge, maybe around 8 feet tall. It was like a scary mix of a man and a wolf. It was standing on 2 legs and had really big shoulders and strong arms like a man. So the legs were long and shaped like a dog's. The entire thing was covered in gray fur. But what really freaked me out was the head. It looked like a wolf's head, only with a shorter and broader snout. The scariest part, though? Its eyes. They glowed back at my light just like a cat's eyes in the dark, white and shining. The creature looked around, slowly checking out its place. Then it finally focused its eyes on me. Then, as if it just noticed me, it twitched slightly, got tense, and let out a loud roar. When I started to take in what was in front of me, I started to freak out. What was this thing? Could it be some mythical creature from a fairy tale? Is this a real creature or some kind of artificial beast? Regardless, it's right in front of me and I need to escape. That's for sure. I was super scared and rushed back to my truck. I was looking for the door handle without taking my eyes off the animal in front of me. It wasn't moving closer, but it wasn't backing off either. I felt so relieved once I finally found the handle. I unlocked and hopped into the cab quickly, slamming the door behind me. I started the truck immediately, and it roared into action. As I quickly pulled away from the rest stop, I caught a final glimpse in my rearview mirror. There was this creature, upright on 2 legs, just staring as I drove off. The more I moved away from that encounter, the more confused I got. The fear that had almost overtaken me slowly diminished, but one question remained, which tormented me through the lonely road trips at night. What was that thing? I went on a road trip by myself across the U.S. Basically, I was dealing with some health problems that I thought were going to be really bad. Thankfully, I'm fine now, but it really made me think. While I was getting treatment, I fell for a national park near the clinic, so I decided that if I recovered, I'd visit as many national parks as possible. So I decided to do it. I was driving through this desert, right? It was ridiculously hot, like you could fry an egg on the road if you wanted. No doubt desert looks cool in the morning and evening, but man, during the day, it totally sucks. I started staying up all night. I would travel and look around in the dark, then sleep when the sun came up. One morning I ended up in a small, worn-out town trying to find a motel. This was before the internet and cell phones, so I couldn't book a room ahead of time unless I called. I slept in a park last night, but today is too hot to bear. I'm dying for some air conditioning in a real room. There are only a couple of others in this motel. Honestly, this town isn't exactly great. It's more like a pit stop on the highway. Good thing, though, there's a state park close by. They didn't have places to camp, but there were plenty of paths to hike. I couldn't wait to go there later in the day. I had a chat with the front desk woman. I told her about what I'd been doing on my trip and my plans to hike that evening. She suddenly got quiet and told me to stay inside when it gets dark, but wouldn't say why. I spent the rest of the day hanging out in my room until it got dark. While going to my car, I bumped into another person staying at the motel. He asked me where I was off to, and I just told him I was going for a walk. He was a bit weird, so I didn't get into any specifics. I was spot on about him. He began talking about aliens. He insisted they're everywhere in the night sky and it's not safe to go out. According to him, these aliens kidnap people, which is why there are many missing cases in the desert. He's going on about aliens. He claims they use birds to spy on us and that birds aren't even real. Honestly, it was a crazy one-way chat. I didn't really know what to say, so I just told him to have a good night and ran to my car. He was practically on his knees, begging me to stay inside. Honestly, I think he believed I was about to die. But honestly, I was more scared of the nut jobs around me than any so-called aliens, so I got out of there. So I arrived at the park and saw a barrier across the parking lot with a sign that read, "Closed due to wildlife encounter." I know it wasn't the smartest move, but I ignored it and went into the parking lot anyway. I was just planning on a short hike, and since I didn't intend to return, I wanted to see as much as possible. I chose a quick path to a viewpoint. Shortly after starting, I saw a shadow pass over me. I couldn't make out what it was, but it was close enough that I could hear the flapping wings. I kept going for another mile without any issue, and then it happened again. I didn't catch sight of it again, but guessed it probably didn't want me there, so I decided to turn back. It swooped over my head for the third time and landed on the trail in front of me. I couldn't see it clearly due to the dim light. It was bright enough to walk without a flashlight thanks to the moon, but not bright enough for me to make out what the creature was. It was as big as a golden retriever and had feathers all over. I first thought it was an eagle because of its size, but then the tail feathers were really long and vividly colored. I pulled out my flashlight from my bag and spotlighted it. Man, you wouldn't believe the kind of face that stared back at me. It looked like a lizard, with a face full of scales. It had feathers coming out of its cheeks that ran all along its body. Its wings had small claws like a bat's, and its back feet were big like a chicken's. Most of its feathers were red, but it had some yellow ones around its face and belly. It seemed like there was some blue on its tail too. It was a really beautiful bird. But its eyes, they looked like a reptile's. I didn't know what I was seeing. I tried to pull out my camera from my bag, but it flew off before I could take a pic. I was super rattled on my walk back to the car. I couldn't get over what I just saw. Another person staying at the motel stopped me and asked if I saw the aliens out there. Turns out, although it's pretty rare, these things do exist. The local folks know about them and everyone has their own guess about what they could be. The native people refer to them as thunderbirds and believe they've been around forever. Not many of them are left and you only see them at night. But still, I'll never forget it. A couple of years back, I visited Point Reyes National Seashore in California, a really stunning place. I got there early in the morning, but it was so foggy I couldn't see the sun. The fog was blocking out the light and made the place look kinda spooky. The fog was so heavy that it sort of dampened all the noise, making the entire place feel eerily quiet. It was pretty spooky, but kind of exciting too. Seeing a place covered in fog really makes you realize how small you are compared to everything else in the world. My job is to go to awesome places and take pictures. So I was there in the fog with my camera. I wasn't just snapping photos. I wanted to catch the whole lonely mystery of the lighthouse in the fog, you know. I had to climb up 308 steps to get there, like climbing up a 30-story building. Once I got up there, the lighthouse seemed even tinier with the huge sea and fog behind it. I fiddled with my camera stuff and started going down. Each time I took a photo, the sound vanished into the thick, silent fog. I took pictures from different directions, fascinated by how the lighthouse seemed to stand up to the weather. I wanted to show the difference between the strong, human-built lighthouse and the overwhelming, changeable fog. Maybe it was the fog or the eerie quiet, but something felt off, like there was this weird vibe that pulled me deeper into the unknown. Now and then, shapes would pop up in the fog, like ghostly figures gone as fast as they showed up. I figured it was just my mind playing tricks on me, trying to make sense of the foggy nothingness. This place was so quiet, it sort of felt rude if I spoke out loud. I was zoning out and found myself in a sort of dreamlike state. It was like I was the only one there. It seemed like I was taking a photo of a black and white painting, and the lighthouse was the only thing standing out in the fog. It was really quiet, but not for long. That's when I saw it come out of the thick fog, like nothing I've ever seen before. Large, sort of human-shaped, but also really different. People say it's the Mothman. I swear, it was just as real as the fog itself. It started as a shadow, slowly taking shape, as if it was having trouble appearing completely. It looked like the fog was shaping its blurry figure. It had red eyes that glowed weirdly through thick mist. You couldn't see a mouth or a nose. It had huge red eyes that seemed incredibly smart, which really scared me. It kind of looked like a human, but it was gray and wide, with large leather-like wings that cleared the fog when it moved them. It was both amazing and scary, sitting there on top of the lighthouse. Without thinking, I started taking pictures, almost like trying to understand what I was seeing. When I pointed my camera at it, this thing started talking. Its voice was kind of like a far-off wave crash, but very clear even though it was foggy. It said, "Be careful with mirrors when there's no moon." Just like that, it disappeared back into the fog. All I had left were the words repeating in my head and some pictures on my memory card. After that, the fog seemed to thicken up, like it was trying to take the creature's place. I stuck around waiting with a sense of fear, but the fog didn't move, and that ghostly thing never showed up again. All I had was the constant noise of the ocean and this creepy feeling of being alone near the lighthouse. I couldn't believe what had happened, and all I had to remember it by was that strange warning. I kept writing about the lighthouse in the fog, but the excitement was gone, replaced by this unexplainable fear and a mystery that was way more interesting than the lighthouse covered in fog. Meeting the Mothman made me really curious and a bit uneasy. I began to look more into the stories and legends about this creature and its supposed scary warnings. I was really trying hard to figure out what "beware the mirror when the moon is lost" could mean. Is it a hidden sign of some coming disaster or just a weird view of our reality? But I couldn't find any answers, just ended up with more and more questions. Time has flown by since the event. It almost feels like it was just a dream. You know how it is when you come across something different. It makes you question everything you thought was real. All I know is I'm on this journey to find answers, going to all sorts of places, camera in hand. Remembering that day still gives me the creeps, especially when it's hard to tell what was real from what wasn't. Every time the moon goes behind the clouds, I get nervous, thinking about that time I met the Mothman and his mysterious message. If the creature shows up again, I hope to be less scared and better ready for whatever disaster it might signal. But for now, all I have from that strange incident is a scary memory and a puzzle I can't solve. So I have this story to tell you about an event that happened when I was working at this little old cemetery in New England. I was the guy in charge of taking care of the place. This is a small old place that's full of our town's history. Living in New England, you get used to weird stuff because it's an old place. Honestly, I kind of like the old graves and stones covered in moss. I know it's weird, but I really like this place. I liked my job as a groundskeeper. I can still remember it clearly. It was in late October, a typical autumn day when you can smell the wet soil and rotting leaves. I was doing my normal duties that afternoon when I began to see some weird stuff. You know, after working at the cemetery for so long, you kind of learn what's typical and what's not. But that day, it was weird, like someone had messed around with the flowers and keepsakes. Some wreaths were out of place, vases were knocked over, and even memorial stones were tossed around where they didn't belong. I got very annoyed when I discovered it. Such a rude thing to do. I thought it was probably a bunch of kids playing a joke, even though I hadn't heard or seen anything to prove it. Usually kids don't mess around with old cemeteries. Old graveyards kind of freak everyone out, even those who aren't usually scared. So, after cleaning up, I just moved on. But then it kept happening. For several days in a row, the keepsakes were messed up. It was only happening in one part of the cemetery, not everywhere. In all my years working as a caretaker here, I've never seen anything like this. Now and then, I felt something weird, like the air around me was buzzing with energy. It felt like when there's too much static in your house and you touch something metal. It started off small but got stronger every day. I didn't think much of it, just figured it was the cold fall wind messing with me. Things started getting weirder and weirder. This one night I ended up staying at the graveyard longer than normal. It was already dark as the sun had already set and the lamplights weren't helping much. I felt something in the air change all of a sudden. It was quite windy and the fallen leaves were moving around. I felt a strange, strong tingle on my skin. It was like something big was about to happen. I felt like I needed to turn around and look down the hill. I've been working in this graveyard for a bit and gotten used to its quirks. I'd never seen anything ghostly before. But that day when I looked over my shoulder, I saw something standing at the end of the field that looked like a person but also not. It looked real but also kind of like moving water. Basically, it was like a person made out of foggy mist. This figure was just standing there in the cemetery. You couldn't really make out its face, just some vague features. It's like when you can't quite remember someone's face from memory. But what really rattled me was its eyes. Its weird face had two glowing balls that seemed to look straight at me. I remember my breath getting stuck in my throat. I could feel my heart racing. I was stuck there, both amazed and scared. The thing didn't move, like it didn't even notice me. It must be some kind of ghost. I knew that much at least. I thought I'd better leave and not bug the creature. It didn't seem to want to harm me. It noted I was there but didn't want to engage with me. I did the same thing. That night when I was in bed, I kept thinking about what happened. I don't know if I believe in life after death, but the idea of someone who's been dead for a while wandering around a cemetery is kind of weird. Plus, some of those graves are really old. It's so ancient it could have been from the Revolutionary War. Crazy to even think about, right? Just picture the kind of life that guy might have had. When I look back, I can't forget that figure with those creepy, bright eyes. You know, I often think back to that day when things felt different. Whenever I see something out of place or knocked over, it makes me stop and think. Whether it's fear or just superstition, it's forgotten when I get back to work and surrounded by the quiet of the graveyard. It's weird, but it's kind of changed how I see my daily grind. So that's what happened. Take it as you want.